Good morning, everyone. Stephen Rothgiese here from the Do Change Better studio. Today is an unusual video. It's a difficult video. It's something that I've been mulling over for the last 3 months at least. But I feel that ethically and professionally, I need to share some of these questions with the audience and together begin to pull them apart and begin to make sense of a scenario that's unfolding with respect to the COVID disruption that I find quite disturbing. So where do we start? I think the first thing to say is that change consulting is about often being disruptive in one's thinking. It's about providing a voice from the edge, as we refer to it. It's not popular thinking, and it doesn't seek to make you friends. What it does seek to do is to understand the full ramification of the problem that we're dealing with, not a mere subsection of a larger systemic issue. We want to understand the whole system, and we want to solve for that whole system. And my contention I'm sharing with you today is I don't believe that we're solving COVID-19 at a whole of system, from a whole of system perspective. I think that we're being far too focused on the health aspect of this. So let me have your permission to draw a couple of pieces, tease a couple of pieces out, and then we can see where we are with respect to this and how we go forward. All right, so the first piece I have a concern about is the role of China in the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. I am not happy with the way in which China has announced the coronavirus to the world. They destroyed samples apparently prior to making announcements to the world. We still don't know who the first 20 or so patients are within the Chinese context, and we don't know who patient 0 is. That for me is a complex web that leads to a number of questions around the true origin of this virus. Here's the contentious piece. In Wuhan, which is de facto involved in high-level testing, in fact, the one is involved in level 4 biohazard testing. For all intents and purposes, let's call it a bioweapons laboratory. Certainly a laboratory that's capable of testing very dangerous pathogens. So we have these two labs, we have a wet market, we have a theory that there was transmission from a bat to a pangolin to a human or in some sort of order. And that might have some merit, but I'm not entirely convinced, and I'd like to ask the question, and I'd like to see the media spend more time on this. Why is it important? It's important because if this virus was manipulated in a laboratory and was then released, I would imagine accidentally as opposed to deliberately, then we're dealing with a very different beast from a novel coronavirus that is zoonotic in nature. There's another data point which I want to link here, which is recent studies done at Flinders University in Australia, which describes the COVID-19 virus strain as connecting exquisitely, that's their word, exquisitely, to human cells. That's not what we would typically expect from a zoonotic, an animal-based virus. And again, like with all of these shows, I'm happy for any expert out there to have a different view. I'm not putting out anything here as fact, right? I'm asking a set of questions. I want us to have this conversation because it feels like it's a growing elephant in the room. So we're not sure where this thing comes from. Reasonable evidence to point to the fact that this was manipulated in a lab. In other words, it wasn't developed in a lab. We're not talking about the creation of a bioweapon. I'm not in any way suggesting that. We're talking about manipulation of an existing coronavirus. We have to ask questions around why is that research being done? What are the ethics around doing virus testing in that way. And that applies not just to China, but to every country in the world, in my view. In fact, safety, as we've written in our recent Survive and Thrive guide, is a key aspect of human life going forward. So the next piece around China, which I want to call out, is recent geopolitical aggression or posturing on the part of China and responses in the region to that. South China Sea, the northern Indian border, the Chinese are clearly showing their military strength at this time. And as a political scientist and as somebody intensely interested in geopolitics, I have to ask why. There's no coincidence. In response to that, and this is the thing that concerns me, Australia in the last couple of days announced a $300 million defense bill in direct response to China's posturing. So where do we find ourselves? To my mind, we find ourselves back in the 1950s, the start of a warm war between China and the US, which is increasingly ratcheted up. Trump withdrew from the World Health Organization. We're going to speak about them a bit more just now, on the basis that the WHO hadn't investigated China in terms of the origin of the coronavirus sufficiently. But there's been increasing tension between these two powers. The thing that concerns me at this point is that Australia now is concerned enough to get in the game. But China clearly has a long-term vision here, and we as citizens of the world should be concerned about that. Because sooner rather than later, we could find ourselves in another warlike type situation, at least similar to the sort of tension that existed between the United States and Russia through post-World War II right up into the 1980s, 1990s. So we've talked enough about China. I think everybody gets the point. The next organization which I'd like to speak to is the WHO. The World Health Organization, in my view, has not been strong enough in its leadership of the COVID-19 crisis. There have been too many changes in policy, too many changes in direction. I also think that there's been a far too cautious approach to lockdown. And lockdown, in my view, as a suppression policy and as a mitigation policy has failed, except in the most authoritarian nations like China. And perhaps to some extent Hong Kong. We don't have a good solution to COVID-19. I do think that an investigation of the WHO is necessary. I do think there needs to be an investigation into how leadership is chosen for the WHO, how that's politically influenced. And I might as well say right up front to you that data is political. We can read data, we can read models in any way we wish to push a particular agenda. We're sitting at day 100 of lockdown in South Africa. Devastation of this economy, some preparation for the surge, not too many deaths compared to other parts of the world, but still a very severe situation here. So, certainly socioeconomically. And that's a key point to be made here that I've made for the past 5 months. If you look back at my posts, in a more subtle way, I've alluded to the fact that the COVID-19 disruption is not just a health issue. Much more so, it's a socioeconomic issue. And how are we going to solve for that? Final thing I want to say before we start talking about lockdown is that the recent reports, it would seem that COVID-19 impacts the whole system of a body, which again points to something that might have been engineered. For what purpose? I'm not sure. And again, that's an ethical question. So in recent days, there have been increasing reports now of not just this being a whole of human system disease profile, but also that the virus is mutating. Now that has a very serious consequence for the development of a vaccine, at least in part. My view is that COVID-19 is here to stay for a while. I know for certain that suppression and mitigation don't work. And I would want to argue strongly for a third alternative called diffusion, which means that we slowly allow the non-vulnerable population to be exposed to the virus in a microdosed and managed way so that immunity can be built up over time. We call this the COVID disruption because it's going to disrupt our society for some time to come. And what that means then is we need to plan from a medical point of view how we treat people. We more critically have to plan our societies, how we go to restaurants, how we go to work, in a way that balances the risk of this disease for most people, because most healthy adults up to the age of 62, children and adults up to the age of 62 with no comorbidities will have a very mild impact of the disease. For the most part. There will be exceptions, but for the most part. There is additional research in terms of blood type, etc., and I think we need to look at that. But again, the reason why we point back to the origin of COVID-19 as being critical is we need to understand what we're dealing with. If we don't understand what we're dealing with, then we can't start a process of scientific protocols to try and develop treatments. You can't develop a vaccine for something that you don't know the origins of and the derivation of and the impact of on the human body. Because the truth is we might never get a vaccine. And if we can't get a vaccine, let's tell the world sooner rather than later in a managed change process so that people can begin to accept that emotionally, psychologically, in terms of their engagement with the world. And I also think it's absolutely vital, and I think we failed in this regard, in that we've created too much fear and anxiety amongst the population in terms of how dangerous this disease is. It is far less dangerous from a health perspective than it is to our societies and our economies. And that will be my next video, the impact on society and economy of COVID-19. Hi YouTube, Stephen Rothgies here at the Do Change Better Studio. Please do like and subscribe. We'll be loading almost daily content up to the channel. See you soon.